Today we're going to begin the first part of the biosphere. So we're starting Unit 5 today. The question that you see is based off of what we talked about in Unit 4. So just kind of go back in your notes, find where we talked about food chains and food webs, and go ahead and answer that question on your first few blank spaces. But what we're going to talk about today is ecology. And there's not really a specific chapter that goes with this. But ecology is the study of the relationship between living things and their environment. So animals, humans, plants, those type of things, that's ecology. So all life on Earth is organized into different levels, and each of those levels are going to interact with each other. So the biosphere is the first level. Okay, it's the biggest kind of picture that you see. If you look here, it's way back here at the back. It's kind of the general term for where everything that's living on Earth exists. Okay, so that's our general term. And then we're going to break that down into other terms. And you can see those here. So we have biomes. That's kind of like the climate zones that we've talked about. Ecosystems, communities, populations, and then the individuals. So the individuals are what make up a population. Populations go in and make up a community. And with what we call abiotic factors, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, those communities make up an entire ecosystem. And the different ecosystems are based on the biomes that they're in. So the different climate zones will have different communities, different ecosystems within them. Okay, so biosphere breaks down into what we call the ecosystem. You can see there are different communities here. It's kind of a vast area, a region. Your community is what's close-knit, so what interacts with each other very closely. And then you have a population. So looking at the community, you have the dragonflies, the fish, the frogs, and you have the heron, whereas in a population, we narrow it down and specifically talk about frogs in general. So we're narrowing it down to a species. And then once we talk about the population, we can narrow it down to one individual organism. So that frog there. Okay. So ecosystems, it's made of abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic components, we'll talk about this in just a minute. But you can see in the image in the middle, you have your abiotic components, which kind of affect things. And then your biotic components kind of interact with everything. So we have cycles, we have nutrients, we have heat, we have decomposers, we have consumers, we have producers. All of those things interact together. So biotic factors, those are the parts of the ecosystem that are living or used to be living. So these are things that are currently living or are to be born, or things that have died and are decaying away. So plants, animals, humans, that sort of thing. Abiotic factors are parts of the ecosystem that have never been alive. Okay, so the heat portion, that's things that are not living. Energy, heat from the sun, all of those things are non-living things. So abiotic factors, where you have energy that's not recycled, you have some abiotic components that are. And the main three that are recycled in a system is the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So we have water, carbon, and nitrogen. You can see that in the images at the bottom. Let's talk about the water cycle. We talked about this with Unit 3, the hydrosphere. And we went through this several times. We've talked about evaporation, condensation, precipitation, infiltration. We talked about transpiration. All of that's in the water cycle. And again, it's recycling itself. So it's being able to be used again. Same thing with the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So the carbon cycle, it is put off by humans, animals. Soil will put off some CO2 back into the atmosphere. Wood, fossil fuels, anything that we're burning, that puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And of course, we talked about trees taking in carbon dioxide and giving us back oxygen so that we could breathe. Okay, so nitrogen cycle, it's the same way. You have nitrogen that's in the atmosphere that's going down into the soil. It's being fixated into bacteria, into plants, into animals. There's a lot going on down there in the soil that happens with nitrates and nitrogen. And then there's actually a loss of nitrogen back into the atmosphere in a gaseous form. So all three of those are cycles that are abiotic factors. But continuing on with ecosystems, we have what's called a niche, and it's the role that an organism plays in a specific ecosystem. Okay, and there's three factors that matter here. So where it lives, number one, that's going to make a big difference as to what role it plays, and how it affects other organisms, and abiotic factors, just like we just talked about. So factors that are non-living factors. So for example, if you think about Finding Nemo, we have a clownfish here in this picture. He lives in an anemone, okay? And where he lives is very important to how it affects other organisms around it. Okay, so it's kind of think back to the Finding Nemo movie for that one. Wrong direction. All right, so food webs. Brief review. This kind of answers your daily question today. Your food chain is a direct line. It's one path of energy. So grass goes to grasshoppers goes to mice goes to owls. Okay. Whereas a food web, it's a flow of energy from one trophic level to another. So it's kind of moving in all directions. So that's the picture here on the right-hand side where you can see the grass. Not only do grasshoppers eat it, but so do rabbits. Rabbits get eaten by foxes and owls. Okay, grasshoppers can be eaten by birds or mice. It's just kind of this big mass. And if you'll think back to the food webs that we actually did in class, it kind of goes along with that. So again, producers, just a quick review. Those use sunlight and they use photosynthesis to make energy, or what we call glucose. And remember I said glucose is like sugar. So we have primary consumers, those eat plants. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. And then your tertiary consumers, those are your top, and those eat pretty much everything else except they are rarely consumed themselves. Okay, so if you think about the image way down here on the bottom, we have weasels, we have humans, and we have bears. The three of us are rarely consumed by anything else. Obviously, bears can consume humans, right? Obviously, we can eat bear meat, or we could eat, huge meats like that, but it's very rare that it's consumed in that manner, at least in nature. So decomposers, these are what's kind of the leftovers. So they eat everything. They help to decompose dead plants, dead animals, and break it back down. So think about fungus, bacteria, those type of things are going to help break down those matter, all that matter, and put it back into the soil. All right, energy. All of this energy that we've talked about for all of these producers, these primary consumers, secondary, tertiary consumers, all of that's used for this list of things. So for growth, to get bigger. For movement, okay, to help them move faster, go longer periods of time without having to eat. To reproduce, to store some of this energy in their body that will later be lost as heat. Okay, so think about animals that we say hibernate in the winter or go into a dormant period. So those have to consume as much energy and as much food as they can, and they store it in their body, and then over the duration of the winter, it gets pushed out of their body as heat to keep them warm. Okay, so if you look at the pyramid here, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, you have way more producers than you have, herbivores or carnivores or the top carnivores. Okay, so you have to have a lot of your bottom dogs in order to feed everything in the system. So biomass, this is kind of what I was talking about. It's the mass of living tissue contained in one level. So there are more organisms, more masses of living items in those lower levels than the higher ones. Because, think about it, grass has to feed so many creatures, okay? Cows feed on grass, deer feed on grass. You have grasshoppers, rabbits, all of these things feed on grass. So we need to have an abundance of grass, right? So that's when we come into what's called a keystone species. And this is the last thing for today. These have a very strong effect on a community. So they are the key to holding that community together. Okay, if you remove that, it can alter the community in significant ways. So if you look at the images here, we're going to say that the sea otter, is our keystone. It's our key individual. Okay, so if you look here, it's kind of the middle block that's holding everything together. We have kelp and we have sea urchin. Now, if you'll notice, the sea otter is actually eating a sea urchin. Okay, well, if we take away that sea otter, if we remove it, everything is going to fall apart. Okay, so we have an explosion of sea urchin. Okay, so we're going to have an abundance of sea urchin come into that population. And because we now have an abundance of sea urchin, our kelp is no longer going to be taken care of, and it's going to be overgrazed, and it's going to start to die out and die down. Okay, so sea otters are very important. They're a key in this community. So keep that in mind. And that's it for today.